The Altamira family had inherited a plot of land in the Sacred Valley, nestled between two forested ridges where mist clung to the slopes like ancient breath. For generations, the family had assumed their property held nothing but stone and soil, until their youngest daughter, Clara, spotted something unusual during the rainy season: a wall of precisely fitted granite blocks, hidden beneath centuries of moss and creeping vines. The stones bore faint geometric patterns, unmistakably Incan in origin, yet no map, no historical record, no archaeological survey had ever documented this particular structure. What began as curiosity, a family excursion to photograph the mysterious wall, evolved into something far more significant. While clearing vegetation to see the markings more clearly, their father Miguel noticed one stone seemed to sit differently than the others, its edges not quite flush with the rest. When the family worked together to shift it aside, they heard something that stopped them cold. The sound of air rushing through a gap, as if a sealed chamber deep within the mountain had just exhaled for the first time in 500 years. The passageway revealed by that single moved stone would challenge everything they thought they knew about this region's pre-Columbian history. Inside lay evidence of Incan burial practices never before catalogued by science, and mummified remains that suggested a story far more complex than any expedition had yet uncovered. What the Altamira family discovered that day would eventually bring archaeologists, rival treasure hunters, and government officials to their doorstep, each with their own agenda for what lay hidden in the darkness beneath the Sacred Valley. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Miguel Altamira stood at the edge of his newly inherited property and felt the weight of ownership settle across his shoulders like fog. The land had belonged to his uncle for 60 years, maintained by a caretaker who had since passed away, left to Miguel in a will that arrived 3 months after the funeral. 8 hectares of Peruvian highlands, dense with cloud forest, crossed by a tributary that ran ice-cold from the higher peaks. No house, no roads, only a narrow trail that locals used to avoid paying tolls on the main highway. His wife, Rosa, had insisted they visit before deciding whether to sell. She was pragmatic about such things, always calculating the price per square meter, always questioning investments that didn't immediately yield returns. Their 3 children had come along more out of obligation than enthusiasm. Their daughter, Clara, who worked in tourism in Cusco, their son Daniel, who managed a tour company, and their youngest 16-year-old Gabriel, who complained about the altitude and the mud. It was Clara who spotted it first. While the others picked their way through the undergrowth, she had wandered slightly upslope, following what she thought might be a natural rock formation. Instead, she found herself facing a wall. Not a natural outcropping, not the work of centuries of erosion. This was constructed precisely, deliberately, with the unmistakable geometric finesse of Incan stonework. The blocks were fitted so tightly that a knife blade could not slip between them, their surfaces worn smooth by time, but still commanding in their deliberate arrangement. "Papa, ven acá," she called, her voice cutting through the forest silence. Miguel emerged from the brush first, followed by Rosa, then Daniel and Gabriel. For several minutes, none of them spoke. The wall extended perhaps 20 meters along the slope before disappearing into the dense vegetation on both sides. The stone had a gray-blue quality that suggested it had been quarried from somewhere higher in the mountains and transported down, a feat that spoke of coordinated labor, of intention, of a structure significant enough to warrant that effort. "This is Incan," Daniel said finally, running his hand across the weathered surface. "Definitely pre-Columbian." "We should report this to the ministry," Rosa said, her practical mind already engaging with the complications. "There could be laws about what we can and cannot do with—" "We should explore first," Clara interrupted. She was already on her knees, brushing moss and lichen away from the lowest stones. "Look at this. There are markings, symbols." What had seemed like simple geometric patterns resolved into something more deliberate as the moss fell away. Stepped patterns. Animal forms that might have been pumas or condors, and something else, carved deeply into one stone barely visible, a series of parallel lines that resembled a map, or perhaps a genealogy, or perhaps a calendar long since stripped of its meaning. Gabriel, despite his earlier complaints, had begun working alongside his sister, clearing away the accumulated detritus of centuries. The work was methodical, absorbing. As the afternoon light began to slant through the trees at a sharper angle, the wall revealed more of itself, not significantly different than what they'd already seen. But each small discovery created a pull, a sense that something more substantial lay just beyond their current reach. It was Miguel who first noticed the anomaly. One stone, positioned roughly in the middle of the wall at chest height, seemed to sit differently than its neighbors, the others locked together with Incan precision, but this one had a hairline gap at one edge. Not much, a fraction of a centimeter, but enough to suggest that either the settling of the earth had shifted it over 5 centuries, or it had been positioned differently than the rest from the beginning. "Here," he said, placing his palm against the stone. It was warmer than the others, as if some deep current of earth warmth flowed behind it. "Gabriel, Daniel, help me." They applied pressure slowly, carefully, uncertain whether they were about to commit an act of profound discovery or profound desecration. The stone resisted at first, then shifted with a grinding sound that echoed across the valley. As it moved inward, something unexpected happened. Air rushed out from the gap, a sudden exhalation that carried the smell of minerals, of age, of sealed earth untouched for centuries. And with that air came something else, a sound, faint but unmistakable, the sound of stone walls extending down into darkness, the sound of a passageway, the sound of a secret kept in silence for 500 years, suddenly released. Chapter 2. Descent into Darkness. The gap was large enough to admit a person, though barely. Miguel retrieved the camping lantern from their vehicle, a LED light powered by rechargeable batteries, which felt almost obscene in its modernity as he aimed it into the opening. The beam caught stone walls slick with moisture, descending at a gentle angle downward into the mountain itself. "We're not equipped for this," Rosa said, her voice tight with a concern that went beyond practical worry. "We don't have ropes or safety equipment or—" "We're just looking," Clara said. She was already removing her jacket, preparing to lower herself into the gap. "We won't go far, just to see what's there." Miguel should have insisted they wait, should have arranged for proper archaeological oversight, contacted the Peruvian ministry, followed every protocol and legal requirement that governed the discovery of pre-Columbian sites. Instead, he found himself handing the lantern to Clara as she settled her shoulders into the opening and began to descend. The passageway was Incan work. That much was immediately evident from the precisely cut walls and the astronomical accuracy of its angle. It had been engineered to direct water downward through the mountain, a Kanak perhaps, or a ritual path meant for pilgrims or priests. The walls were smooth where hands had gripped them over centuries, and there were steps cut into the stone at regular intervals, worn concave by the passage of countless feet. Clara descended, then Daniel, then Gabriel. Miguel came last, Rosa remaining above with the second flashlight, unwilling to venture into an unmapped void despite her curiosity. 20 meters down, the passage opened into a chamber. It was Clara's gasp that alerted the others to what the light had found. The chamber was roughly rectangular, perhaps 4 meters across and 3 high, its walls fitted with the same Incan precision as the exterior wall above. But it was not empty. Along one side of the chamber stood a series of alcoves carved into the stone, and in those alcoves sat pottery vessels. Not crude earthenware, but carefully crafted vessels with geometric designs and what appeared to be Quipuca Mayak markings, a record-keeping system that had been lost to scholarship. Beside the vessels lay the mummified remains. 4 of them, at least. Arranged in sitting positions, their bodies preserved by the dry mountain air in the sealed chamber, their skin darkened by age, but intact. They wore what remained of textiles, alpaca wool probably, or possibly cotton imported from lower elevations. Their faces, though withered, retained enough definition to suggest they had been important individuals, nobles, priests, or warriors. "Nobody move," Daniel whispered, as if the mummies might somehow wake, as if the ancient dead might object to being discovered. But it was Gabriel who made the crucial observation. "Look at the glyphs, Yao," he said, pointing to markings carved into the alcove walls. "These aren't on any record I've ever seen." He was right. While the style was unmistakably Incan, the characteristic step patterns, the stylized animal forms, the specific arrangements, and the apparent narrative they told was unlike anything in the historical record. These glyphs seemed to tell a story, a sequence of events carved into stone with intention. A chronicle, perhaps, a genealogy, a record of something that the Spanish conquistadors or subsequent centuries had somehow failed to document. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. They had found not just mummies, not just a tomb, but evidence of an aspect of Incan history that had been completely lost to modern knowledge. A chamber sealed so completely that neither Spanish conquistadors during the conquest nor subsequent centuries of archaeological exploration had discovered it. "We need to photograph this," Clara said. "Before we do anything else, we need documentation. We need—" The sound cut off her words. A dull rumbling, faint but distinct, seemed to emanate from deep within the mountain. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to send a cascade of small stones falling from the upper corners of the chamber. "The rain," Daniel said immediately. "This high in the valley, the afternoon storms can be intense. If the runoff hits the mountain wrong—" He didn't need to finish. All of them understood the danger. A chamber sealed for 500 years might not be stable under new conditions. The passageway they'd descended through channeled water. If a storm flooded it, if the ancient drainage system became overwhelmed. "We're going back up," Miguel said firmly. "Now. We come back with proper equipment, proper documentation, proper—" "Wait," Gabriel interrupted. He had moved to one of the alcoves, his young eyes catching something in the lamplight. "There's an opening. Behind the vessels. It goes deeper." None of them had time to explore further before the rumbling came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of water flowing down the passage above them. The ancient Incan engineers had designed the chamber to survive rainfall, but 500 years of sealed conditions meant the channels might be blocked, the system compromised. They fled upward, climbing the steps two at a time, the sound of rushing water pursuing them toward the light. Chapter 3. The evidence by morning. The rain had stopped, and the sky above the sacred valley had cleared to that brilliant, almost painful blue that only appeared after a storm at this altitude. Miguel stood before the gap in the wall with a proper camera, documenting everything methodically, while Rosa insisted on calling an archaeologist colleague of hers who worked at the university in Cusco. The situation had become complicated overnight. Word traveled fast in the valley. A neighbor had noticed their vehicles, the cleared undergrowth, the obvious disturbance around the Incan wall. By evening, there were questions. By this morning, there were official inquiries. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived by midday, an archaeologist in her 60s with 3 decades of experience in the highlands. She examined the wall, the gap, the passageway with professional scrutiny, asking careful questions about what they had found, what they had touched, what they had documented. When she descended into the chamber herself and emerged 40 minutes later, her expression had shifted from professional interest to barely contained urgency. "This is unprecedented," she said, setting her documentation equipment on the ground with careful precision. "The mummies, the glyphs, the chamber construction, none of it matches any known Incan burial site, which means either this is a forgery of exceptional sophistication, or we found something genuinely undocumented." "Could it be Tiwanaku?" Daniel asked, referring to the pre-Incan civilization, "or some other culture?" "No," Elena said. "The construction techniques, the architectural style, this is definitively Incan, probably dating to the reign of Pachacuti or shortly thereafter. The 1400s most likely. But the contents don't correspond to any known nobles, any known events." That was when they heard the vehicles, 4 of them, approaching on the narrow mountain path with deliberate speed. They belonged to men in official uniform, representatives from the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, accompanied by local police. Their arrival was courteous enough, but the intention was clear. This site was now under government jurisdiction. No further exploration without permits, without supervision, without the full legal machinery of the state. If you've disturbed anything, the lead official said, there will be questions about proper procedure, about permits, about— We've been waiting for you, Elena interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with bureaucracy. Dr. Vasquez, Ministry of Archaeology. These people have made a discovery that requires immediate documentation and analysis. I suggest we establish a proper perimeter and begin systematic survey. What followed was a controlled chaos of authority and expertise. By evening, a team of archaeologists had been assembled, equipment had been brought up the mountain, and the site had been marked as an official excavation zone. The ministry issued a preliminary statement. The chamber would be studied, the mummies would be analyzed, and the implications would be assessed. But privately, Elena took Miguel and Clara aside. There's something else down there, she said quietly. Gabriel mentioned an opening, a passage going deeper. I was able to confirm it during my examination. Whatever is in this chamber is not the complete archive. Whatever they were trying to preserve, this is just the beginning. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your location might inspire our next mystery. Chapter 4. The Rival. By the third day of excavation, two developments had shifted the tenor of the discovery from academic opportunity to something more complicated. First, the analysis of the mummies had begun revealing their secrets. The textiles they wore contained dye patterns that suggested they belonged to the nobility of the Inca state, but not any documented lineage. Their burial goods, the pottery, the metalwork, indicated they were warriors or priests of significant rank, but there was no corresponding history, no legends, no chronicles, no records that mentioned them. It was as if 5 centuries ago, the Incan state had gone to extraordinary effort to hide these particular individuals from history itself. Second, a man named Sergio Montoya had arrived. He presented himself as a representative of a private historical foundation based in Lima, interested in documenting pre-Columbian archaeological discoveries. He was polite, professional, and he carried credentials that appeared legitimate enough that the ministry officials didn't immediately turn him away. But Elena noticed something in the way he studied the site, in the careful questions he asked, in his obvious disappointment when access to the deeper passage remained restricted. He's eluded, Elena told Miguel on the evening of the 4th day. Not officially, but there are collectors, private collectors in South America and Europe who pay very well for Incan artifacts that come through proper channels. Legal channels, technically, but the intent is always to divert significant finds from museums and into private hands. What does he want? Clara asked. Everything, Elena said. If there's anything portable down there, anything that could be documented, photographed, assessed, and then privately preserved, he'll find a way to acquire it. The ministry is slow. Bureaucracy moves at its own pace. He just needs them distracted long enough to establish the provenance and value of what's here. That night, Daniel noticed that the equipment storage had been disturbed. Nothing was missing, but someone had rifled through the documentation, the preliminary photographs, the equipment records. The next morning, Sergio Montoya was gone. He'd left no message, made no obvious departure. He simply ceased appearing at the site. But he'd achieved his goal. By the time Elena and the ministry archaeologists realized what had happened, the information about the chamber's contents had already been transmitted to collectors in Lima, to auction houses with international connections, to private museums with no public accountability. The knowledge of what they'd found was now in circulation. Within a week, offers had begun arriving. Private institutions wanting to acquire the mummies, collectors offering substantial sums for artifacts, for the pottery, for the textiles. The ministry found itself under pressure from multiple directions, bureaucratic demands, financial temptations, and the knowledge that even if they refused all offers, the information was already out there. The deeper passage, however, remained sealed. No one had gone further. The passage Gabriel had glimpsed continued downward at an angle that suggested it ran deeper into the mountain, possibly connecting to a larger chamber or a series of chambers beyond. But accessing it required equipment, planning, and authorization from multiple government agencies, the kind of process that could take months or years. Miguel found himself in the position of being both a discoverer and an outsider. His family's property had become the focal point of official investigation, but they had been effectively removed from the process. Armed guards now protected the site. Access was restricted. The family was thanked officially and then politely informed that further involvement wasn't necessary. It was during this period of frustration and waiting that Clara made her discovery. She had gone to the archive room where the preliminary documentation was being kept, looking for something specific, a detail she remembered seeing in the photographs of the deeper passage. What she found instead was a discrepancy. The photographs Elena had taken showed what appeared to be a sealed door at the point where the passage descended further, but there was no documentation of what was behind that door. No survey, no description, nothing. "They haven't opened it," Clara told Daniel and Gabriel that evening. "The ministry, Elena, everyone, they're treating it as unexplored. But what if it's not? What if someone already went down there, already saw what was inside?" The implication hung between them. What if Sergio Montoya's interest had never been in the current chamber? What if he had known somehow that there was more, something deeper, something significant enough to warrant his careful attention? And what if he had found a way to access it? Chapter 5. The Deeper Chamber. It took another week for Elena to convince the ministry that the deeper passage needed to be opened, properly documented, and assessed. Another week of reports, of meetings, of bureaucratic processes grinding forward at their glacial pace. By the time proper equipment had been assembled, rope anchors, ventilation systems, lighting rigs, documentation protocols, the mountain was entering its rainy season in earnest. The passage descended at a sharper angle than anyone had anticipated. More than 30 meters down, the air growing colder and slightly stale, suggesting the deeper chamber was sealed more completely than the first. When Elena's team finally emerged into the space beyond, even the experienced archaeologist's voice carried a note of wonder. This chamber was larger, much larger. It appeared to be an underground temple or ceremonial space, with walls covered entirely in glyphs and narrative scenes. Carved into the stone were figures that suggested ritual, that showed priests and nobles in postures of ceremony or conquest. And arranged around the space were more mummies, at least a dozen, positioned in alcoves that suggested a hierarchy of importance, with the largest and most elaborate alcove at the chamber's far end. But there was something wrong. One of the mummies, the one in the central alcove, the one that appeared to have been the most important, was missing. The alcove was undisturbed otherwise. Pottery vessels remained in their positions. The textiles that had lined the space were intact, but the mummified remains that should have been there was gone, as if carefully removed with knowledge of proper archaeological procedure, as if someone had understood exactly what they were doing. "Montoya," Daniel said, though it was more confirmation than question. Elena was examining the remaining artifacts, making notes, photographing the scene. "He knew," she said, her voice tight with professional frustration. Somehow he knew this chamber existed. He knew what was in it. And he knew the value of that specific mummy. The lineage markers on the alcove suggest this was an Incan king or a regional commander of exceptional importance, possibly someone who was deliberately hidden from Spanish records during the conquest. The implication was staggering. If Montoya had accessed and removed a mummy before the official excavation, then he had stolen not just an artifact but a piece of history itself. He had removed evidence that might have solved mysteries about this period of Incan history, mysteries that now might never be answered. Clara was examining the glyphs with Gabriel. Between the narrative scenes and the ceremonial images, they found something else, what appeared to be a map. Marked on the stone were geographical features, mountains rendered as triangles, rivers as flowing lines, and several structures marked with symbols that suggested temples or administrative centers. But none of these structures matched any known sites. They were all placed in locations that suggested they lay deeper in the valley, places that had never been excavated or even formally recognized. "He wasn't just here for that one mummy," Gabriel said, pointing to sequences of glyphs that seemed to tell a story. "Look at the sequence here. These marks, they look like records, lists. This chamber isn't just a tomb. It's an archive. It's proof that there was an entire administrative system in this valley that nobody knows about." That realization shifted everything. The first chamber had been significant. But this was the key to understanding an entire aspect of pre-Columbian Peruvian history that had been completely lost. The ministry moved to secure the chamber completely. The deeper passage was sealed behind reinforced barriers. Guards were increased, and an international alert was issued for the missing mummy, the artifact that Montoya had stolen and could now potentially move through black market channels worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But more importantly, the ministry authorized a full excavation. Over the following months, as the rainy season passed and the dry season returned, Elena's team worked methodically through the chambers. The second mummy was never recovered. Montoya had disappeared into the network of antiquities smugglers, the missing artifact joining the countless pre-Columbian pieces that had vanished into private collections around the world. But what they discovered instead was something that no single artifact could have provided: a complete understanding of a lost administrative system. The glyphs, when fully translated, revealed records of tribute, of battles, of religious ceremonies, and of a regional ruler who had deliberately chosen to separate himself and his lineage from the official Incan chronicles, either as punishment or as an act of deliberate rebellion. The maps on the chamber walls led to 4 other archaeological sites in the valley, each one a smaller administrative center or way station that had been completely missed by 5 centuries of exploration. Each one yielded artifacts, records, and evidence that suggested this particular ruler and his people had maintained an independent network within the empire itself. Chapter 6. The Legacy. 18 months after the discovery, the full findings were published in a series of papers that shifted the academic understanding of Incan administrative systems. The sites were given official protected status. The ministry established a new regional museum in the nearest town, a repository for the artifacts that couldn't be moved, for the records and replicas of the glyphs, for the mummified remains that had been recovered. Sergio Montoya was never apprehended. Interpol issued a formal request for his apprehension, but he had effectively vanished. The stolen mummy entered the world of private antiquities, its location unknown, its presence a reminder that despite legal protections and institutional oversight, the market for pre-Columbian artifacts continued to fuel the removal of history from public knowledge. But something had shifted for the Altamira family. Their property had become an archaeological site, protected under Peruvian law, which meant they could never develop it, never extract resources from it, never use it as they had originally planned. They would receive compensation, of course, and recognition for their discovery. But the inheritance they had received was now forever bound to the past in a way that prevented any personal use. Yet Clara found herself drawn to work in the archive that had been established at the museum. Daniel began consulting with the ministry on tourism protocols for the sites, ensuring that the discovery could be shared with visitors while maintaining the integrity of the excavation. Gabriel, inspired by what he had glimpsed in those glyphs, enrolled in university to study Andean pre-Columbian history. Miguel and Rosa visited the chamber sometimes, especially during the dry season when the passages were fully accessible. They would stand in the space where they had moved that single stone and found so much, and they would think about the choices that had led them there. The true value of their discovery, they came to understand, had never been monetary. It had been the restoration of a forgotten chapter of Peruvian history, the recovery of a narrative that had been deliberately hidden 500 years ago and accidentally preserved in stone. The mummies that had been undocumented in any official record now had context, had meaning, had a place in the larger story of a civilization far more complex than the conquistadors had ever acknowledged. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.